In the year 942, the existence of Normandy hung by a single thread, a thread clutched in the hand of a 10-year-old boy freezing in the shadow of a blood-soaked bridge. As the body of his father, William Longsword, vanished into the icy waters of the Somme, enemies were already carving the country into pieces, convinced that the wolfish enclave was living out its final hours. But this child did not merely survive. He smelted the Scandinavian fury of his ancestors into a new iron will, ready to conquer a continent. Richard the Fearless emerged before the world as the era's most dangerous paradox. Raised in the shadow of betrayal, he was meant to become an obedient puppet, yet he chose a path that transformed a band of raiders into the most formidable elite of the Middle Ages. The world awaited his fall, but the young ruler erected fortresses where his predecessors had left only ashes. Today you will learn how a loyal servant managed to steal the destiny of Normandy from the very heart of the royal castle, why a Christian duke was forced to summon pagan gods to the banks of the Seine, in what manner a young hostage outplayed the last great monarch of the Carolingian dynasty, and exactly how, in the fires of this war, that specific Norman identity was born, an identity that a century later would redraw the map of the world. This is the story of how power, born in blood, lays the foundation of an empire. We will see how Richard built impregnable walls, realizing that his father's success served only as a fragile facade behind which a precipice yawned. He took a leap into the unknown, between vengeance and the necessity of creating a nation where the law stands higher than the sword. The history of Richard remains relevant today. True power lies not in blind adherence to tradition, but in the ability to transform it under colossal pressure. To survive, the young duke had to stop being a victim and become the architect of history himself. The victory of the assassins at the bridge of Picquigny seemed absolute. The Count of Flanders and King Louis IV assumed that with the death of William, the Norman project was closed. The land was concentrated in their hands, and in the royal castle languished the sole heir, stripped of an army. But they forgot that wolves do not recognize foreign shepherds. Richard needed a plan that would transform him from a hostage to an avenger. In 943, Louis IV enters Rouen not as a guest, but as a master. He promises the boy protection while his soldiers occupy the key towers. The trap has snapped shut. Normandy has frozen on the brink of being swallowed by the French crown. Left alone with the ruins of his father's ambitions, 10-year-old Richard took upon himself the crushing weight of the crown. The young duke believed that the loyalty to King Louis IV, which had been cultivated in Rouen for years, would protect him. He hoped that the status of an ideal vassal would function in a world where a signature on parchment was supposed to mean more than a strike from an axe. However, reality proved far more cynical. The Carolingian monarch saw in the boy not an ally, but an annoying obstacle on the path to absorbing the wealthy northern lands. Under the pretext of care, the heir is whisked away to the fortress of Laon, effectively turning him into an honorary prisoner. Yesterday's ruler found himself a hostage, whose life depended entirely on a royal whim. Before us stands the image of a wolf cub in a gilded cage. He is hand-fed by those who dream only of his pack's demise. Meanwhile, the political map of France was changing rapidly. The fading Carolingian Empire was attempting to reclaim its former grandeur by swallowing the Norman enclave. While French garrisons occupied Rouen, in Laon the boy watched daily as he was stripped of his roots and forced to submit to a foreign will. The shadow of total extinction loomed over Normandy. The child found himself at the epicenter of a game where his only weapon was observation. A young palm, not yet hardened enough for heavy steel, clenched into a fist at the sight of French counts mocking his family's past. The Duke came to a conclusion. In a world of treacherous smiles, faith in another's decency is equivalent to a death sentence. Why did Louis IV commit this miscalculation? He assumed that power over the child granted power over the people. The monarch underestimated the foundation erected by Rollo and William, a basis that turned out to be far more solid than it appeared from Paris. To the king, the heir's young age served as a sign of weakness, but for Normandy itself, the boy transformed into a living banner of resistance. The Duke realized, to save his legacy, he had to stop playing by someone else's rules. Submissiveness turned into a mask. Behind the walls of Laon, a daring plot matured, designed to return the wolf to his native forests. But the boy needed a loyal comrade, someone who would risk their head for a bastard who had already been written off. The walls of Laon seemed insurmountable, and the guards incorruptible. However, in the shadows of the stables, there is always those whom great kings fail to take into account. The faithful servant Osmond realized delay would rob the Duke of the chance to see Rouen alive. At night, under the cover of the fortress's fitful sleep, began one of the most desperate rescue operations in history. The prisoner, hidden inside a truss of hay, was smuggled out of the citadel right under the noses of the sentries. This is not simply an escape. This is the return of a predator to his domain. However, the road home promised a new threat. To drive out the invaders, the hero had to call upon those his father had spent years trying to pacify. He had to appeal to the old Normans, who saw the Christian cross merely as a convenient target for an axe. Upon returning to Rouen, Richard found his inheritance in ruins. It resembled a patchwork quilt being torn apart by predators. In the south and center, the French garrisons of Louis IV held sway, while in the west, chieftains dreaming of returning to the old ways were raising their heads. The young Duke hoped that his mere appearance would rally Normandy, but he quickly realized legitimacy is just a pretty word that must be backed by sharpened steel. By 947, the situation had become critical. The King of France was amassing forces for a final strike. Richard faced a choice that defined his entire reign. He could remain a pious Christian sovereign and perish in the rubble of his palace, or execute a daring maneuver by turning to the harsh legacy of his ancestors. At that moment, the mouth of the Seine turned dark with the sails of Longships. Richard summoned the fleet of Harald Bluetooth. This step did not mean a return to paganism. Harald had already taken the cross, yet he retained his northern fury. This pragmatic alliance shocked contemporaries. The Norman Duke opened the gates of Europe to those his ancestors had pledged to protect it from. The irony of the situation was staggering. Louis IV had spent years instilling French manners in Richard, but had only taught the hostage how to exploit Carolingian weaknesses. Every lecture on vassal loyalty was now transformed into a weapon against the mentor. Richard saw that the French crown hung on intrigues, and he countered them with a northern might that was impossible to calculate. Imagine Richard, a youth in an exquisite cloak standing on the deck of a longship amidst grim veterans of the north. His hand firmly grips the hilt of his sword, and his gaze is fixed on the shore, where the French army is completing its formation. In this instant, on the banks of the Dives River, the fate of the future structure of European power was being decided. The Battle of the Dives turned into a catastrophe for the Carolingians. The Normans and Danes operated with ruthless coordination. Richard proved that his name was not an empty sound. In the heat of battle, the unthinkable happened. Louis IV was taken prisoner. The moment of highest triumph coincided with the greatest risk. The hostage of yesterday now held the monarchy itself by the throat. But why did Richard not kill the king? Here his true genius was revealed. He realized a lively captive is the key to legitimacy. The Duke used Louis as a bargaining chip, demanding recognition of Normandy's independence. However, victory came at a price. To hold on to power in the 950s, young Richard had to accept the guardianship of the powerful Count Hugh the Great. He exchanged a royal cage for the patronage of the most influential man in France. This period taught the fearless one the main lesson. True independence is forged through years of quiet diplomacy. He did not seek peace, but rather erected walls, understanding that his success was merely a temporary respite. Richard was destined to become the architect not only of fortresses, but of alliances that would render his figure untouchable. The 50s passed under the sign of quiet consolidation. Richard methodically restored the land, and by the 960s it became clear Normandy was no longer a wolf's enclave. The Duke represented the complete opposite of his father, harboring no illusions regarding the mercy of his neighbors. His mind, hardened by captivity and the guardianship of Hugh the Great, demanded a different order. The young ruler began the mass construction of stone castles, smelting the Scandinavian fury of his people into unbending resolve. Before us unfolds a story of survival in a world that had already tried once to erase his name. While Richard strengthened his borders, the French court of King Lothar prepared for revenge. A powerful coalition of neighbors rose against the Duke, striving to tear his domains apart. The conflicts of the 960s became a stress test for the entire Norman system. In this struggle, the Norman genius manifested itself. Instead of simply waiting behind walls, the ruler masterfully pitted his enemies against one another. The irony lay in the fact that the bastard son of a concubine now appeared a more organized ruler than the legitimate heirs of Charlemagne. But Richard went even further. To finally cement his status, he executed a maneuver on the verge of political cynicism. He introduced into his house the daughter of his main pursuer, Emma, the very daughter of that same King Louis IV from overseas. This marriage turned a sworn enemy into a relative. Richard wove his blood into the genealogical tree of kings, creating a shield of matrimonial bonds where swords had failed. He understood legitimacy serves as a shield just as reliable as a steel hauberk. While the Carolingians drowned in internecine strife, the Duke built a system where every knight knew his place and his family entered the highest European elite. The culmination arrived when the neighbors realized the futility of their attacks. Richard did not merely repel the assaults, he forced the world to recognize Normandy as a sovereign state. The old order finally capitulated before the new. Richard had reigned for over 20 years, longer than many ruling dynasties of that era existed. The ruler proved he could hold the land by force and by marriage. However, he realized true power rests on faith. To become part of Europe, it was not enough to defeat its kings. One had to conquer its God. Richard the Fearless, who had returned northern warriors to the Seine, was now preparing for the most unexpected maneuver of his life. he decided to transform his warlike people into the most zealous Catholics on the continent. But behind the pious gestures lay cold calculation. The Duke understood the Church is the ideal instrument of control. The era of the Great Transformation was approaching, where the axe gave way to the cross, and Normandy transformed into a stronghold of new faith and order. Over 40 years of rule, Richard transformed Normandy from a Viking camp into the heart of European civilization. The fearless Duke watched as the last veterans who remembered Rollo passed into history. He realized, if their grandsons remained simple raiders, the country would vanish. A new type of subject was required. Thus, scattered settlements transformed into the most organized duchy in France. The foundation of this transformation was the Church. Richard restored abbeys such as Fécamp and the strategically vital Mont Saint-Michel, turning them into centers of literacy and administration. The clergy provided the Duke with what the axe could not, a disciplined bureaucracy. But there was another architect of internal stability, Duchess Gunnora. Gunnora, Richard's second wife, embodied the new Norman identity. While the Duke erected fortress walls, she managed internal affairs, skillfully weaving Scandinavian traditions with the French way of life. An educated and influential co-ruler, she guaranteed that the local nobility would not dissolve among the French counts, nor would they turn feral like their Viking ancestors. In this period, Scandinavian speech in Rouen finally gave way to the French language. Richard personified this synthesis. He was excellently versed in the subtleties of law, while retaining a harsh martial ethic. Northern names disappeared from the lists of the elite, replaced by the names of saints, yet, beneath the silk of their cloaks, the steel remained the same. Normandy turned into an incubator for a new aristocracy, combining the fury of the North with Latin order. What ensured the success of this project? Richard smelted the memory of the Vikings into a majestic myth of origin, granting his knights a sense of exceptionalism. By the finale of his reign, the duchy had occupied the position of a key player, and the ruler himself acted as an arbiter in the disputes of kings. However, the fearless one's most massive political move was still waiting for its hour. By 987, Richard had reached a status his father had not dared to dream of. He had transformed into the mastermind of French history. It was his support and authority that allowed Hugh Capet, the son of Richard's former guardian, to ascend the throne of France. The Duke effectively ended the Carolingian era and opened the Capetian era, which would last for centuries. But his ambitions extended beyond the continent as well. Richard realized Normandy needed allies across the sea. By giving his daughter, Emma of Normandy, in marriage to the English king Aethelred, he created a solid dynastic link with the throne of England. It was a brilliant strategy. The Duke wove Norman blood into the English crown, leaving a hook that, decades later, would give his descendants a claim to London. 54 years of rule turned Richard into a living legend. He was passing to his son, Richard II, not just lands, but a fine-tuned mechanism of war and governance. He had built Normandy into a fortress capable of weathering any storm, and prepared a staging ground for the great conquests of the future. In 996, departing from life at the age of 64, Richard the Fearless felt a sense of calm. He had completed the transformation of Vikings into Normans. From the shadow of his achievements, the silhouette of the one who would take the decisive step was already emerging. His great-grandson, William, born 3 generations later from a forbidden love, would ascend the throne of England, relying on the very alliances that Richard had formed. The era of Richard was a time of creation, but the foundation he built was intended for a structure of incredible scale. His history is the bridge between a pirate longship and a royal throne. Richard the Fearless took the ashes left by his father and forged from them a steel reality that would eventually swallow England. A 10-year-old hostage entered the game and left it as the acknowledged master of politics of his era. In this lies the main paradox. The man who saved Normandy with the help of pagan Vikings ended his path as a reliable pillar of the Christian world. True power is born not only in battles, it manifests in the ability to dictate one's rules to enemies. The Norman duchy was saturated with this truth for centuries to come. But Richard's triumph was merely the first step. He cultivated a force that would soon find the borders of France too confining. Following him onto the stage comes a man born of forbidden love. William, known as the Bastard, will turn this duchy into a staging ground for a campaign that forever changed the map of the world. His name is William the Conqueror, and humanity remembers his legend to this day. Subscribe so you don't miss the story of how William the Bastard walked the path to his crown. Smash that like button if you think you could have survived the golden cage of Laon as Richard did. And let me know in the comments, do you consider him a genius, or did he simply get lucky amidst traitors? See you next time.